All right. Okay, so hello, welcome back. It feels like it's been a while since the last live session. Today we're moving into the 1960s and we're going to talk about civil rights and some riots. Um, I'm going to focus in our class a little bit more on rights movements outside. We're going to talk a little bit about Black Power, but when I say civil rights, we're not just focusing on the African American civil rights movement. Part of the reason is there's a lot of different rights movements that are very running parallel to African American civil rights during the 1960s. And then the other part of it is for your sources in history assignment for this week, you are watching an episode of Eyes on the Prize that focuses on African American civil rights. And you're watching an episode that focuses a lot on riots. So I didn't want to lean too heavily on that and be overkill. It's kind of hard because riots are my specialty as a historian, but I tried to kind of hold back a little bit. All right, so let's kind of frame the decade of the 1960s. Part of the reason why I chose to break the 60s across 2 weeks for our online class is because there's just a lot that happens in the decade. People have written entire books about the year 1968, both within just American history, but also international history. There's just a lot that happens in this decade. And part of the interest in the 1960s is that there is this really powerful series of movements driven by young people throughout the 1960s that expand our notion of what civil rights are and who has access to civil rights. So if the 1950s as a decade was all about people sort of trying to conform to mainstream attitudes about how you were supposed to live, because they were so desperately afraid of being labeled different, because in the 1950s, if you were labeled different, then you were suspected to maybe be communist, which could completely derail your entire life. So if the 1950s is about people trying to sort of hide, fit in, avoid rocking the boat, the 1960s is about dissent. It's about protest. And as I mentioned, a lot of this is driven by young people. If you think about it, the demographic that we looked at in the last chapter of the textbook, the baby boomers, the earliest baby boomers were born in 1945. So as of 1960, they're now like 15 years old. Okay, so the first wave of baby boomers are becoming teenagers and going to college and getting drafted to go to Vietnam during the 1960s. Remember, the baby booms from 1945 to 65, so it's a pretty big generation. So there's a lot of difference between early boomers and later boomers. But the earliest wave of baby boomers, this again massive generation, is coming of age during the 1960s, and a lot of them are rejecting the way of life that they grew up in. They don't want to live like their parents do. They want to break away, become something different, and a lot of them want to change the world for the better. So we're going to talk about a lot of different movements today within the 1960s, and one kind of through line that all of these movements have in common is activism by young people. Okay, young people making changes and trying to make the world a better place, at least what they felt would be a better place. So we're going to kind of look at a couple of different movements today. We're also going to take a look at the Supreme Court because there are some big movements when we're talking about civil rights and definition of civil rights there. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to save the sort of culture part of the 60s. So talking about things like hippies and religion and music and pop culture. We're going to save that for next week. All right. So you've already been reading in your textbook and reading through assignments or watching through assignments about the African American Civil Rights Movement, which a lot of people kind of conceive of, at least in popular imagination, starting in the 1950s. The reality is that as you guys have been reading in your textbook, right, is that the civil rights movement within the Black community is far older than that. But what is it? What are some key events that take place in the 1950s that kind of make the movement more visible nationwide? What are some like things that happen in the Black civil rights movement in the 50s that you can think of that kind of help kick it into another gear? Go ahead, Lavender.
Is this the time when like black college students were sitting in the white section and what is it called, like a sit-in?
Yes, sit-in protests, right? So the first sit-in protest is actually 1960. So you're right on the money there. Okay, so yes, college students are engaging in sit-in protests, right? They're occupying what are supposed to be whites-only spaces in the segregated South. So that's one thing. What else is going on? Think about kind of like classic example that if you say civil rights 1950s, everybody thinks of this lady sitting where? Yes, Lavender.
Rosa Parks sitting on the bus.
Right, Rosa Parks sitting on the bus, the Montgomery bus boycott, and that's kind of the first sort of major activism that involves a young minister named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And that happens in 1955. It's almost a year-long boycott. So a lot of people think civil rights, they think Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s. There's also the 1954 Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education, which does what? Brown v. Board of Education says separate and unequal is not a thing. So it overturns Plessy v. Ferguson and paves the way to end segregation in a ruling about school system, but it's a broader ruling. So by the time we get to the 1960s, we actually have a sort of parallel movement coming up within the Black civil rights movement called Black Power. Black Power movement, the Black Power phrase is coined by Stokely Carmichael, who was a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the group that comes out of those first sit-in protests in Greensboro, North Carolina. Carmichael coins this term in 1966. And Black Power as a term means a couple of different things. It could mean advocating for more political power for African Americans, more economic success and prosperity, but also a need to revolt against the racism baked into the power structure, what we call systemic racism. So the Black Power movement is more assertive than what a lot of people were used to dealing with folks like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who couched things in a more sort of like religious and more comfortable terms. Now, I don't mean to say that white people were never made uncomfortable by Martin Luther King Jr. One of the things, Joy, sorry, Joy was wagging her tail and she's hitting Mateo's crate door. One of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. says in the letter from a Birmingham jail is beware is kind of the white moderate, right? The people who are saying the right things, but they don't want to do the work. And especially towards the end of his life, Dr. King would identify with a lot of the ideas of the Black Power movement, and he would become more aggressive in promoting campaigns to address systemic racism and things like poverty or African Americans being drafted at higher numbers and sent to Vietnam and thus higher numbers of casualties, things like that. So we tend to think of him as very moderate today, but by the standards of the 1960s, at least for white people, he was not as moderate. But he's often kind of painted as a moderate in counter juxtaposition with Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a member of a group called Nation of Islam, which is not related to the religion of Islam. It's a different group. It borrows some ideas. It is not mainstream Islam. He was born Malcolm Little, and he converted to the Nation of Islam while he spent time in jail. He had lived a very sort of checkered life as a young man, had gotten into trouble with the law. And one of the things that the Nation of Islam preached was Black self-sufficiency and success. And for him, he started ruffling feathers when he publicly took issue with the nonviolence preached by King. And, Malcolm X said, well, I understand the principle of nonviolence, right, which is designed to make your cause look more moral and just. But at the same time, like, I don't think it's wrong if somebody's trying to beat the crap out of you to defend yourself. And so a lot of people kind of took those comments and said, well, he's advocating violence. It's a little bit more complicated than that. After a 1964 visit to Mecca, which is the holiest pilgrimage site within the religion of Islam, he actually softened his rhetoric. He started shifting away from the Nation of Islam towards mainstream Islam, and he was assassinated in 1965. And so very often he and Dr. King are kind of set up as this juxtaposition between, like, if you are a fan of Marvel, in the X-Men, Dr. Charles Xavier and Magneto, right? Like they both want better things from mutants, but they have very different ways of getting there. So the Black Panther Party is another kind of expression of this, more sort of in-your-face advocacy for rights. They're founded in Oakland in 1966. And they advocated for self-defense against police brutality. So they said that African Americans should exercise their Second Amendment rights and have firearms and protect themselves against police violence. And in particular, this scares the bejesus out of a lot of white people. And there's concerted efforts by both the FBI and local police to target the Black Panthers for this. And a lot of Black Panther leaders actually end up being killed in shootouts. And that's kind of the headlines that most people know about the Black Panthers. But the Black Panthers were about community improvement as well. They opened health clinics, schools, programs for kids, food pantries. So they were really about improving their community holistically, but their desire to defend themselves with force if necessary is really what kind of grabbed headlines. There's also this impact of Black power beyond just political activism on culture at large. So we see this with the Black and Beautiful, or the Black is Beautiful campaign, trying to push against this notion that a lot of beauty standards in the West favor sort of white standards of beauty, like, for example, straight hair rather than curly hair, or your nose being shaped a different way, or your skin tone being lighter is what made you beautiful. They're pushing back on that. You can hear about it in pop music, like James Brown's Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. There's also a switch from using the term Negro to instead Afro or African American. And again, the embracing of traditional culture and again, kind of pushing back against Western standards. So embracing things like the Afro hairstyle, right, which did not, use chemicals or other means to permanently straighten your hair to look more white, but instead embracing your natural curl texture. So much like the Black Power movement is shaped by initially younger activists like college students like Stokely Carmichael, we also see the New Left movement being shaped by college students, in this case, mostly white college students. There are a lot of historical roots. So even though the nickname is the New Left, there's lots of things we can kind of trace it being connected to, like abolitionists from the 1800s in terms of their beliefs about social justice. The old Democratic Republican Party we talked about in History 1301 from the 1790s in terms of talking about free speech. The Bohemian movement in the early 1900s and talking about sort of social morals. And they're also very heavily influenced by Black Power and civil rights movements. What a lot of the New Left talks about is this notion of um, society not having a say in government. That government had almost evolved into kind of an oligarchy, right? Where only a few people had actual power. They wanted government that was more responsive to the people, more mass participation in democracy and voting, and a more equal playing field for people of different races and genders. So, one great example of this new left movement in action is the group called Students for a Democratic Society, founded in 1962. And their founding statement of purpose, the Port Huron Statement, criticized the status quo, arguing that we needed to pass political reforms to enable more people to be able to vote and hold government accountable. But also, we needed to change the way we lived, that society had become sort of deeply consumerist and individualist, and that we needed to think of the greater good. By the end of 1962, there were about 8,000 members of the Students of Democratic Society, and there are chapters formed throughout the United States. And part of the reason that the SDS grows so rapidly throughout the 1960s is there are a lot more people going to college. By 1968, there are 7 million college students in the United States. So the baby boom generation is taking advantage of the increasing wealth overall in the United States, that it's now more affordable to go to college. And they're not just passively taking classes while they're in college, they're actually participating in a lot of these protest movements. Most notably at UC Berkeley in 1964, students lead a protest movement against restrictions on free speech that the UC Berkeley administration had introduced. And what starts as pushing back over cracking down on what people can say on campus eventually evolves into a full-blown critique of the modern university system. That college was supposed to be a place not just to kind of stamp you with a degree so you could go get a job, but a place of actual sort of learning and intellectual expansion. Students staged sit-in protests in the Berkeley administration building, and the university eventually repealed the free speech ban in 1965. One of the things that's coming up later this month that I'm going to start sending you guys reminders for is we're actually having a guest speaker at EPCC, Dr. Ken Hammond, who's a history professor at New Mexico State University. He was actually the president of the Kent State chapter of Students for Democratic Society when the Kent State shooting happened. He was there that day, so he's going to talk about what happened at Kent State, the lead up to it, and how a protest against the Vietnam War ended up turning deadly. He's a fantastic speaker. I've seen him give that presentation before. That will be an extra credit opportunity event. And again, I would not recommend missing it, especially because this is is this the 50th anniversary or was last year the 50th anniversary? I always forget whether it's 70 or 71. I always get the dates confused off the top of my head, but it's a really powerful presentation. So one of the things that all of these different rights movements brought to the surface was that women were still fundamentally unequal. Like, yes, they could vote since 1920, but a lot of women who participated in these different protests and movements in the 1960s still faced a very sort of patriarchal society and power structure where men had the power. A lot of women were, their contributions to these movements were sort of looked over or they experienced harassment. And so a lot of women started to focus on the need to reform women's rights. And when we talk about feminism in the 1960s in the United States, we're describing what we call second wave feminism. So, first wave feminism is the push to get women the right to vote. So, we can kind of say that's from like Seneca Falls in 1848 to 1920, women get the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. And then the second wave feminism is about women getting equality in society. And that oftentimes is attributed to, in the United States at least, the publication of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. So when Betty Friedan wrote the book, The Feminine Mystique, she was tackling the gender roles that we see in the 1950s. This notion that women had to be confined to the home, the domestic sphere, regardless of their education, their talent, or their personality, whether that was a good fit for them or not. And one of the things that Friedan brought up in her book was that the feminist movement had kind of stopped in 1920. That after we got the right to vote, there was really a lack of forward momentum on what next. And in particular, Friedan and second wave feminism are going to point to two sort of areas. The lack of equal opportunity for women at work, and a legal system that still gave women less rights than their husbands. So one of the organizations that pushes for women's rights during 1960 is the National Organization for Women, or NOW. Betty Friedan served as its first president. And NOW is a very middle class, mostly white movement of feminists. And their main focus in the 1960s is equality in the workforce. They start to make some gains when President Lyndon Baines Johnson creates the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, which pushes against discrimination in the workplace. The first step to trying to get women equal pay is the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Spoiler alert, women are still waiting on equal pay, including me. And I think today it's closer to, for white women, about 80 cents to the dollar that their male counterparts earn. During this time period in the 1960s, it was closer to like 66, 68 cents to the dollar. So improvements have been made. But again, it depends on who you are as a woman, because for Latina women, it's still closer to about 55, 60 cents an hour today. So it's still pretty bad. Now, there's a parallel movement in American feminism that is more what we call intersectional. And when we talk about intersectionality, that means including all these different groups. So this is a movement driven, the women's liberation movement is driven more by lower class women, women of color, younger women, and oftentimes they're more radical. They agree with now that women need to have better economic opportunities, but they also say that women really need to push back against traditional societal gender roles and to also advocate for personal freedom in terms of controlling their own body. So one of the more famous protests of feminism in the 1960s is a protest at the 1968 Miss America pageant, where women put items of oppression in a trash can. So things like high heels, copies of Playboy magazine, bras. And this is where we get the idea of bra burning from, that these angry feminists set their bras on fire. No bras were set on fire at this protest. That is an urban myth. Number one, bras are expensive. And number two, some of us really need them. So even though they're oppressive, they're kind of necessary. So the women's liberation movement, again, is trying to push back on this expectations of beauty, right? That women have to go to all of these lengths, like waxing and shaving and all of this stuff to be considered presentable, or they have to, diet or starve themselves to have an acceptable body type. But they're also, again, focusing on bodily autonomy. And so for a lot of women, this meant better access to birth control, including the relatively new birth control pill, which had been introduced in 1960, but was initially only available as a prescription to married women. there's also campaigns to legalize abortion because birth control is not widely accessible yet in all of its different forms. And so there's also campaigns to make abortion legal and therefore to make it safer. Because abortion had been illegal since about the 1870s. That's really when attitudes about abortion and birth control drastically change in the United States. And so some women were making the argument that if we legalized it, women could decide for themselves whether that was an ethical decision they were comfortable with, but also it would be safer because a lot of women trying to get abortions during the time period where it was illegal, if you were upper class or upper middle class, you could probably avoid to pay, or you could probably pay a doctor under the table and be okay. If you were a lower class woman, you were going to people who didn't have medical licenses or weren't doing it safely, and there was a high risk of death um, or significant injury. So there are lots of other rights movements within the 1960s, and I'm going to just give you a very brief Cliff Notes overview here. One is civil rights movement for LGBTQ folks. Even Joy. No barking. Sorry. For LGBTQ folks, there was still this stigma. There was this perception that it was something that was a lifestyle choice, or it was something that was inherently connected to sin or mental illness. And as a consequence, a lot of people lived closeted lives, right? They weren't open about their sexuality or for trans folks, their gender. And there starts to be somewhat of an organized pushback against this, at least in small ways, with the formation of the Mattachine Society in 1951 by Harry Hay, which tried to work against those perceptions. But really, it's not going to be until the end of the 60s where we start to see a more visible and prominent LGBTQ rights movement with Stonewall. Stonewall Inn was a gathering place for LGBTQ folks. It was a bar. It was a gay bar, and police raided the gay bar, as police oftentimes did. And at this point, the patrons pushed back, and it evolved into a 5-day long riot. And Stonewall became kind of a rallying cry for LGBTQ individuals to push for better, more humane treatment, both within the legal system but also society. And one of the things that often happens when we talk about Stonewall, especially the thematic, dramatic film version by Roland Emmerich, is that Stonewall is driven a lot by trans women of color. And they tend to kind of get erased a lot in discussions of Stonewall. But after this, we'll see LGBTQ individuals push towards decriminalizing what we call in the legal system sodomy. In other words, that's sex that is any kind of sex that's not just penis and vagina, so oral or other sex acts, but also to decouple sexuality from this notion of mental illness, which we'll see in the 1970s happen. There's also lots of activism within the Latinx community. We see this with Cesar Chavez, whose birthday we had off last week, which is why we didn't have a live stream last week. He was the leader of a union known as the United Farm Workers, which helped to mobilize agricultural communities. And while it was initially centered on farm workers, this kind of mushroomed and developed into a larger movement for Latinx rights as well. Another prominent activist associated with the Latinx movement in the 1960s is Dolores Huerta, who spoke at EPCC last week. And the Latinx community gets a lot of their strategies from Martin Luther King Jr., and they also lead nonviolent protests. And this is accompanied by rising pride in Chicano or Chicanx identity in the United States. Similarly, there's also a movement for greater civil rights for Native Americans. During the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, there was a lot of attempts to try to dismantle the reservation system, not in a good way, like to get rid of it completely and to get rid of this notion of semi-autonomy that tribes had. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, who's president in the early part of the 1960s, suspends this attempt to try to minimize Native American sovereignty or autonomy. And we see, again, driven by young people, groups like the Indian Youth Council and the American Indian Movement using the language of anti-colonial movements globally and demanding more self-determination for Native American groups. And also highlighting how much land had been seized from Native Americans. For example, they occupied the island of Alcatraz in the San Francisco Bay, site of the notorious Alcatraz prison, to highlight that it had formerly been Native land that had been seized. And we start to see Native activists in the 1960s again kind of take a page from the African American civil rights playbook and start a process of not only protest but also litigation, okay, using the court system to try to make gains to give them more autonomy and also to rectify past wrongs like land seizure. So I mentioned that we're going to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court, in part because of its importance in both reaffirming some existing civil rights, but also potentially expanding the notion of civil rights. So there are a couple of categories in which we see the Supreme Court have important rulings throughout the 1960s and 70s. Initially in the 1950s, the Supreme Court starts making rulings that lead a lot of people to question whether civil liberties will be adequately protected. For example, they had reaffirmed the right to be able to imprison someone just for being communist, not committing a crime, but just identifying with a particular political movement. And that alarmed a lot of people because that was seen as a restriction on freedom of speech. But starting in 1957, the court makes this sort of shift, and we start to see them uphold civil liberties in a series of cases. For example, they heard a number of free speech cases in the late 1950s and early 1960s involving the civil rights movement. One notable one is New York Times v. Sullivan, which was a case that came out of the New York Times and their coverage of the civil rights movement in the South, basically being very critical of Southern states and their continued embrace of segregation and violence against African American activists. And so some of those Southern entities sued the New York Times and basically said that was libel. And the Supreme Court said, no, citizens and the media have the right to criticize government, to express dissent. That's part of freedom of speech. So you can't sue them just because you don't like it. And that is a really important kind of step to affirm that all of these people who are protesting and pushing back against what they see as unfair government laws are protected under the First Amendment. There's also focus on getting rid of discriminatory laws, most notably the case of Loving v. Virginia in 1967. The Lovings were a couple from Virginia, and Mr. Loving fell in love with Mrs. Loving, but they could not legally get married in Virginia because he was white and she was black. And Virginia, like many other states, had laws that said you could not marry someone of a different race from you. And so they actually had to go across state lines to get married legally. And then they returned to Virginia. And when Virginia officials, government officials, found out that they were married, they basically told them, you either get divorced immediately or we will throw you in prison for 5 years. So instead, the Lovings sued, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favor and overturned bans on interracial marriage and said you cannot restrict who people marry on the basis of race. So that was a very important ruling. And then we also have a series of rulings, both sort of affirming existing rights, but also paving new ways for new rights or an expansion of what we think of as rights. One example is the Miranda case. This is, I guarantee you, you're familiar with the outcome of this case because this case was about the rights of individuals who were being arrested. What are the Miranda rights? If you've watched any cop shows, I guarantee you, you know what these rights are. Whenever law enforcement arrests somebody, what do they have to say? Anybody want to volunteer? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you do or say can be held against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. And if you cannot afford one, one will be appointed for you by the court. These are what we call the Miranda rights. So basically, the Miranda case says that law enforcement has an obligation to remind you of your existing rights within the system upon the time of your arrest. And if they fail to, then you cannot be held. So that's kind of, again, sort of an affirmation of existing rights, just making it so that you have to be reminded of your existing rights. And then the Griswold and Roe cases are going in a different direction when it comes to rights. Both of those were around reproduction. Griswold is about birth control, and particularly bans on birth control. So Connecticut, like many other states, had banned the use of birth control by unmarried individuals, or in certain circumstances, particularly the birth control pill. And when this case was heard before the Supreme Court essentially said that Connecticut had overreached, that they were trying to regulate the behavior of two consenting private individuals in their own home, that this was not constitutional. And so it's actually from Griswold that we first see this idea of a right to privacy, because that's what the case hinged on, was that this was a government violation of your privacy in your individual home to pass a law like this. So again, privacy is not mentioned as a right in the Constitution, but Griswold is one of the core cases from the Supreme Court that builds this idea that we do have a right to privacy. So it's an incredibly important ruling, both in the context of expanding access to birth control, but also in the context of your expectation of a right to privacy. And then Roe v. Wade accomplishes the legalization of abortion that a lot of women's lib activists have been pushing for, excuse me, under the argument that this was tied to women's bodily autonomy. Abortion is still a very thorny issue today in American politics. Our notion of sex, conception, abortion, etc., has changed very greatly over time. If you're interested more in kind of charting the evolution of American attitudes about things like sex and abortion, I highly recommend the book Sex and the Constitution, which is a legal history of things like birth control or LGBTQ folks or abortion. And it's really, really interesting to look at how attitudes have changed over the years. All right. So, as I already kind of hinted at the top of this class, 1968 is an exceedingly important year for history, both globally and domestically. So this is American history class, so we're going to talk about the U.S. in particular. So there are a lot of things going on in 1968 that make it a dynamite year. One is Vietnam, and we're going to talk more about Vietnam next week because we're going to talk about anti-war protests in the culture section. The United States, as your textbook has been chronicling, have been involved in one way or another in Vietnam since the 1950s. especially as the French tried to hang on to Vietnam as a colony following World War II. The United States had initially begun loaning money and then weapons and then military advisors to first the French, who lost, and then the South Vietnamese, who went against the Geneva Accords and refused to hold elections to form a new unified Vietnam government. At that point, the United States in the early 1960s starts committing to troops in Vietnam to try to counter what they called was the spread of communism, because North Vietnam leaned communist. So the United States have been in Vietnam since the early 1960s. Again, a little bit more on that in detail next week. But a couple of things happened in the Vietnam theater of war in 1968. One was the Tet Offensive, which was during the Vietnamese New Year holiday of Tet. It was an intense attack by the Viet Cong, or those aligned with North Vietnam, against Americans, which, when reported, increased the unpopularity of the war. There were a number of notable American atrocities in Vietnam that came to light in 1968, like My Lai, which again we'll talk more about next week. And so there's this push to start for peace talks. And because of the Tet Offensive in 1968, Lyndon Baines Johnson actually declines to run for re-election, leaving the presidential race kind of up in the air. There are a number of assassinations that take place in 1968. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis while organizing a Poor People's March to highlight issues of poverty. As I mentioned earlier today, he had, towards the end of his life, become very vocal about issues of poverty, about the Vietnam War. He was very much against the war. And the assassination of King sparked a wave of riots across the United States in protest of his killing. There's also the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother. Robert F. Kennedy was one of the people running for the Democratic nomination, since Johnson was not running again. And Kennedy was specifically running on an anti-war platform. Kennedy had actually served in his brother's administration before his brother was also assassinated in 1963. And Kennedy was actually killed while campaigning, shot by a Palestinian nationalist. And for a lot of people, this was a complete shock, both because it was the second Kennedy assassinated within 5 years, but also because he was seen as very charismatic, as a very promising figure within the Democratic Party. Speaking of the Democratic Party, there's also chaos at the Democratic National Convention held in Chicago. Anti-war protesters gathered outside of the convention. By this point in time, Kennedy had already been assassinated. There's still a fight within the Democratic Party over whether to nominate someone who was anti-war, like, for example, Eugene McCarthy, or someone who was closer to Johnson and might continue the Vietnam War, like Hubert Humphrey, his vice president. Police start attacking the anti-war protesters outside of the Democratic National Convention. Chaos ensues, a full-blown riot, and 8 of the protesters were charged with inciting the violence, with their initial convictions later overturned. So 1968 is full of chaos. Hubert Humphrey will eventually get the nomination for the Democratic Party. And we don't have enough time really for me to show you some footage from the Democratic National Convention riot, so I'll toss it on Blackboard for you. But this is an exceedingly big turning point. All of the chaos of 1968 helps to elect Richard Nixon, who we'll talk about more when we get to the 1970s. And in particular, kind of marks a slow change and a pushback against some of the social movements of the 1960s. Nixon claims that he represents what he calls the silent majority, ordinary Americans who felt the 60s had gone too far, had been too radical, and that all of the things that were wrong with Americans came out of the 1960s. So we'll talk more about that in coming classes. But do know that 1968 is an incredibly important pivot year for American politics and American culture. In particular, it's also a really important year, again, as I mentioned, internationally. There's a lot of like failed attempts to kick out communism in Eastern Europe, for example. But again, this is not my world history class, which, are we covering that this week? No, we're covering that next week in my world history class. So y'all are almost in the same place, those two classes. So we're going to wrap up here. Does anybody have any questions?